So in this video, I'm going to talk about how we use tenses in English when we're telling stories. And I figured that the best way to go about doing this would be by telling you a story and then taking a look at some of the tenses that I've used in it. Now, all the text of my story is in the description box below, so you can follow along if you like, or you can look up any vocabulary that you're unfamiliar with. It would also be good if you were to try and identify the tenses that I'm using whilst I'm telling the story. It would be even better if you were to click the subscribe button that's down in that side of the screen whilst you're watching as well. But I think that's enough of an introduction. Let's roll the credits and I'll get into the story. I once saw an interview with Stuart Copeland. He was the drummer from the rock band The Police, and he was talking about how the band's audience had changed over the years. And he was saying that in the band's heyday back in the mid-1980s, their audience was largely composed of young women who'd throw their underwear on the stage. But then when the band reformed some 30 years later for a global tour, mainly the people that went to see them were middle-aged men who would stand there crying. Maybe they were crying about their lost youth. But anyway, that's the thing about rock and roll. It starts with the thrill of the new and then ends up as nostalgia. The first proper gig that I went to was the Jam in the summer of 1981, and I was 14. Now, although the Jam didn't achieve all that much success internationally, they were absolutely huge in Britain at the time, and I was introduced to them by my friend Dave. Now, Dave, having lived in London before his family moved down to our quiet, rural part of the West Country, he was simply much more streetwise, much more sussed, and he knew much more about music and bands than I did. And he introduced me to them, and he said that they were absolutely incredible, having seen them before. And when he found out that they were going to be touring not that far from where we lived, he arranged tickets. I had absolutely no idea what to expect, and when we arrived at the venue, I thought it was absolutely huge, even though looking back it probably only held 2,000 or 3,000 people. And when we got there, there was a support band on stage, but everybody was just ignoring them. In fact, the biggest cheer they got that night was for simply leaving the stage, because it meant we were getting closer to that moment when the Jam were going to come on. And now I can remember this almost as though it was yesterday. The house lights go down, the band's manager appears on stage and he's shouting out some sort of introduction. And then the crowd just surges to the front of the stage and you're just carried along with it. And then we hear the sound of Paul Weller's guitar before we see him on stage. He'd started playing this enormous sounding riff before he'd even walked out in front of us. And then he's joined by the rest of the band, and you don't so much hear the drums and bass as feel them punching through your ribcage. It was like nothing I'd ever experienced before. 15 minutes later, and there is sweat dripping from the ceiling of the venue. And there are people who have fainted in the suffocating heat, being carried out over the heads of the crowd to the waiting security guards. It was absolute mayhem. Now, from a musical point of view, it's probably not the best gig that I've ever been to. In fact, it was probably pretty shambolic. But it was my first gig, and for that reason, nothing has ever come close since in terms of pure visceral excitement. Now, Paul Weller, the band's guitarist and songwriter and singer, has gone on to have a very successful solo career afterwards. And occasionally in his shows these days, he'll play 2 or 3 songs from the Jam, back from his days in the Jam. And if you look in his audience, you'll see little gaggles of guys now, probably in their early 60s, either bald or with grey hair. And when they hear those songs, it's like some sort of trigger. It's almost Pavlovian. And they go absolutely crazy, probably trying to relive those moments from their youth. But for me, the strangest part of this whole story is that of Bruce Foxton, the band's bass player. Because after the Jam split up at the end of 1982, he tried his luck with all sorts of other groups, but never with the same degree of success, until one day he joined a tribute band. You know, tribute bands are those bands that play cover songs but of only one act. So you've got the Australian Pink Floyd, for example, or you used to have Bjorn Again, who only used to play ABBA songs. Well, of course, the tribute band he joined was a tribute band to the Jam. So 40 years later, he's playing the songs every night that he used to play for real. In a sense, you could say that he's become his own impersonator. But that's the thing about rock and roll. It always starts out with the thrill of the new and ends up as nostalgia. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the tenses that I used in the story by focusing on 4 sentences within it. And I'm going to start with the first one. And what I said was this: I once saw an interview with Stuart Copeland. He was the drummer from the rock band The Police. And if we take a look at that sentence, we can see that I used the past simple tense twice. I once saw an interview with Stuart Copeland. He was the drummer from the rock band The Police. Now, the past simple tense is going to be our go-to tense when we're talking about things that have happened in the past. So I could say, I flew to London. I stayed in a hotel. I met up with some friends, we had dinner. All in the past simple tense, and we're going to use it a lot. However, it can get quite repetitive and monotonous to listen to. And within the English language, we've also got lots of other ways of talking about action in the past. And we're going to use those other tenses to break up our stories to make them richer and more interesting. So the second sentence of my story uses 3 tenses, and none of them are the past simple. He was saying that in the band's heyday, their audience was largely composed of young women who would throw their underwear on the stage. So within that sentence, we've got the past continuous tense, we've got the passive past simple tense, and we've also got a habitual past tense as well. He was saying that in the band's heyday, their audience was largely composed of young women who would throw their underwear on the stage. So what I'm going to do is break this sentence down into 3 component parts and take a look at each tense one by one. And let's start with the past continuous. He was saying that in the band's heyday, and so on. Now this is the past continuous tense, and we construct it by using either was or were plus the ing form of a verb. He was saying that in the band's heyday. Now in this particular example, I could have used the past simple tense. He said that in the band's heyday. However, I'd already used the past simple tense twice in the first sentence of the story, and it was probably beginning to get a little bit repetitive. And also here, I had the opportunity to invite the listener closer into my story by creating the sense that this interview with Stuart Copeland was ongoing. And that's why I'd chosen to use the past continuous tense. He was saying that in the band's heyday. So here I've changed up the tense to the past continuous simply to enliven the story. Let's move on to the next tense, the passive past simple. Their audience was largely composed of young women. Now we construct the passive past simple by using either was or were, and then the participle of the verb that we're interested in, compose in this case. So we have their audience was largely composed of young women. So in a passive construction, the audience in this case is the subject of our sentence, but it is not the agent of the verb. It is not the thing that is doing, in this case, the composing. Now, if I'd chosen an active construction, I could have said, young women formed a large part of their audience. However, I wanted us to focus on the audience itself, and so because of that, I'd chosen a passive construction in this case. Young women would throw their underwear on stage. Now, the final part of this sentence uses a past habitual tense that we construct using the word would and then a verb, and we use it to describe habitual action in the past. It's like creating an imperfect tense in Spanish, for example. Now, often you're going to hear the use of would and a verb in a conditional clause. If I was rich, I would buy a castle. But here, because of the context of the story, we're in the past, we can identify that this is a habitual past tense. Young women would throw their underwear on stage. Now, you may have noticed that in the heart of my story, at the most important moment, I made a very deliberate choice to start using present tenses, the present simple and the present continuous. And the sentence that introduced this change was this one. The house lights go down, the band's manager appears on stage, and he's shouting out some sort of introduction. Now, if I was back in school and I had written that for my teacher as an essay, it would have come back covered in red ink, because grammatically, we're not supposed to be able to talk about the past using present tenses. However, if you listen to English native speakers, they do it all the time. And they do it because it's a means of making the most important part of a story more dramatic. It makes it present and it invites our audience to really join us in the narrative. Now, that is not to say you can simply construct a story using the present simple tense. So if you were to say, I fly to London, I stay in a hotel, I meet my friends for dinner, we have a good time, then that isn't exciting, that's simply terrible grammar. No, choosing the moment in which we shift to the present tense is very important. But that's what I was trying to do in the middle of my story. The house lights go down, the band's manager appears on stage, and he's shouting out some sort of introduction. So at the end of my story, I talk about how Bruce Foxton, the bass player from The Jam, is now playing in a tribute band that is a tribute to his original band, The Jam, if that makes any sense. But anyway, I use this sentence in the story. So 40 years later, he's playing the songs every night that he used to play for real. And within that sentence, I've used the present continuous tense. He's playing the songs every night to give that sense that this is ongoing action. And then I've used a form of the habitual past that I hadn't used up until this point of the story. So let's take a closer look at that. He's playing the songs he used to play. Now, this habitual past tense is created out of using the phrase used to and then the verb we're interested in, and it describes habitual, repeated action in the past. So I could say, when I was young, we used to go to the beach after school. When I was young, I used to sing in a choir. Now, earlier in the story, I used a different habitual tense when I used would plus a verb. Young women would throw their underwear on stage. Here we've got an alternative construction, used to do something. So in this case, Bruce Foxton used to play those songs with The Jam. So what have we learned? I think we've learned that the past simple tense is going to be our go-to tense, our most important tense when telling stories. And that makes sense because they happened in the past. However, if we overuse the past simple tense, our stories will begin to sound a little bit flat and a little bit boring. So today, in addition to making a lot of use of the past simple tense, I also use the past continuous tense, two forms of the past habitual tense, and I even moved into the present tense with the present simple and the present continuous, just to make things more interesting and to add variety to my storytelling. Anyway, I hope you found that useful. If you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button and I'll catch you on the next one. Take care.